Imagine a medieval castle, its towers seemingly touching the sky, stone walls defying the passage of time, and a drawbridge creaking as it lowers, as if welcoming you to a world of knights, ladies, and epic battles. Castles, those iconic symbols of the Middle Ages that star in fairy tales and Hollywood films, evoke images of lavish banquets, gleaming armor, and gardens where princesses stroll under the sun. But the reality of living in a castle between the 9th and 15th centuries was anything but a dream. These fortresses, built to withstand invasions, raids, and wars, prioritized security over comfort, turning daily life into a constant battle against cold, filth, smells, noise, and an endless list of inconveniences that would make even the bravest knight yearn for a modern home with heating and running water. Forget the lack of Wi-Fi or Netflix. Castles were uncomfortable in ways that defy modern imagination, from icy walls that seemed to sap your soul to latrines that made a modern public restroom seem like a luxury spa. Join me on this journey to the past, with a touch of humor to keep us from despairing over the cold, damp, and stench of manure, and discover why living in a castle was more a test of survival than a fairy tale life. Castles were built in strategic locations, hilltops, rocky cliffs, or beside turbulent rivers, to make them nearly impregnable. This was great for keeping enemies at bay but turned everyday tasks into a Herculean odyssey. If you've ever climbed a steep hill with a grocery bag, imagine doing it in 20 kilos of armor, hauling a barrel of water or a sack of grain, while the wind whips you and the muddy path threatens to swallow your boots. The trails leading to the castle were narrow, bumpy, and slippery from rain, snow, or ice, making the transport of supplies, firewood, or even a bucket of water an exercise in patience and brute strength. Carts, when they existed, got stuck in the mud, and the donkeys or horses pulling them weren't always in the mood to cooperate, especially after a storm. Servants, the unsung heroes of the castle, had to be logistics masters to keep resources flowing, and any delay could mean running out of food, firewood, or water at the worst possible moment. The drawbridge, an iconic castle feature, added another layer of complication. Operating it required several men, ropes, pulleys, and a mechanism that, if not well maintained, could jam at the most inopportune time, leaving everyone trapped inside or outside the castle. The walls, made of thick stone that could reach 4 meters wide in the sturdiest castles, were nearly impenetrable but turned the interior into a giant refrigerator. The stone absorbed cold in winter like it had a PhD in freezing, keeping rooms at temperatures that would make an Arctic penguin shiver. In summer, they offered some coolness, but humidity seeped everywhere, leaving a musty smell that clung to clothes, furniture, and even the souls of the inhabitants. Castles were poorly ventilated, and the air was a toxic mix of mold, chimney smoke, and the scent of people who didn't bathe as often as we'd like to imagine. If you've ever walked into an unventilated gym after a spin class, multiply that by a couple of centuries without deodorant, add a hint of manure from nearby stables and a whiff of forgotten cheese, and you'll get a rough idea. Humidity also wreaked havoc on objects. Wooden furniture swelled, metal tools and weapons rusted, and tapestries, a luxury reserved for the wealthiest castles, grew moldy, turning the castle into a damp cave rather than a cozy home. Cracks in the walls, though small, let in drafts of icy air, and attempts to seal them with mud, straw, or rags were like trying to plug a hole in a ship with a handkerchief. Inhabitants wrapped themselves in layers of clothing or blankets to fight the cold, but this added weight and clumsiness, especially when navigating narrow spiral staircases that seemed designed to cause falls. Chimneys were the main source of heat, but don't imagine a centralized heating system with a thermostat and a cozy ambience. Medieval chimneys were inefficient, and smoke often lingered in the room, filling it with soot and leaving everyone coughing as if they'd inhaled a pack of unfiltered cigarettes. Keeping a fire going required a staggering amount of firewood, meaning someone, usually an exhausted servant, spent the day chopping trees, hauling logs up a hill, or wrestling with damp branches that refused to burn. There were 24-hour firewood delivery services, and storing dry wood was a challenge in a place where humidity reigned supreme. Indoor temperatures in winter rarely exceeded 10 degrees Celsius, and if you wanted to stay warm, your best bet was to huddle so close to the fire you risked singeing your eyebrows or cuddling with the sheep in the stables, though that brought its own issues of smell, fleas, and judgmental stares from the animals. Chimneys weren't evenly distributed. Main halls might have one or two, but smaller rooms, towers, or servants' quarters often lacked them, leaving inhabitants shivering. Tapestries, hung on the walls of richer castles, helped insulate a bit but were expensive, collected dust, mold, and who knows what else, becoming a breeding ground for medieval allergies. Servants tasked with keeping chimneys lit dealt with constant smoke, flying ashes, and the risk of burns, and it wasn't uncommon for a poorly managed fire to spark a blaze in the wooden ceiling beams, turning the castle into a giant bonfire. Wet firewood, common in rainy climates, produced even more smoke, making the air nearly unbreathable, and inhabitants often wore extra layers of heavy, damp-smelling clothing or blankets to combat the cold, which made navigating narrow hallways or climbing stairs even more cumbersome. The interior design of castles didn't help matters. Halls were large, empty, and had stone floors that seemed designed to freeze your feet, even through leather boots. Rugs or floor tapestries were a luxury reserved for the wealthiest nobles, and even then, they didn't cover the entire space, leaving vast areas of icy stone that absorbed any body heat. Furniture was scarce and rudimentary. Wobbly wooden tables that buckled under the weight of plates, hard benches without backs that turned meals into an endurance test for your spine, and beds that, at best, were wooden frames with a sack of straw on top. If you were a lucky feudal lord, you might afford a feather-stuffed mattress, but even these were infested with fleas, bedbugs, and other unwanted guests that turned sleep into a battle against itching. Sleeping in a castle was like playing Russian roulette with insects. You never knew if you'd wake up with bites, a mouse nesting in your hair, or something worse, like a beetle exploring your pillow. The straw in beds flattened over time, leaving lumps that made sleeping feel like lying on a rocky field after a storm. Wealthier nobles might have curtains around their beds for some privacy and protection from the cold, but these trapped dust, odors, and more bugs, creating a microclimate of discomfort that made sleep more an aspiration than a reality. Chests used to store clothes, blankets, and personal items were heavy, hard to move, and often smelled of dampness, making it difficult to keep anything clean or organized. Nobles could afford more elaborate furniture, like carved chairs or decorated tables, but even these were more functional than comfortable and often cold to the touch due to the chilly castle environment. Windows, or rather, the lack thereof, were another issue that turned castles into dark caves. To maximize security, castles had narrow openings called arrow slits, designed for shooting arrows or keeping watch on enemies but letting in little light or air. Larger windows, when they existed, often lacked glass, only having wooden shutters that closed to block wind, rain, or cold. This meant rooms were as dark as caves during the day, and at night, you relied on tallow candles, torches, or oil lamps that barely illuminated and filled the air with smoke. Imagine trying to read a parchment, if you even knew how to read, with a flickering candle that went out every few minutes from a draft sneaking through the cracks. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheap but smelled like a bad day at the stables and produced thick smoke that irritated eyes and throats, leaving everyone teary-eyed and with a slight headache. Beeswax candles were a luxury for the wealthiest nobles, but even these produced smoke and could extinguish easily if a gust came through a poorly sealed arrow slit. Torches, common in hallways and large rooms, were unstable, left soot marks on walls, and could start fires if a careless servant dropped one. Oil lamps offered slightly steadier light but were expensive, required constant maintenance to refill oil and clean wicks, and weren't available to everyone. The lack of light made nighttime tasks like sewing, writing, or even walking without tripping over a chest or table a challenge that tested patience and eyesight. Inhabitants often went to bed early to save candles, meaning nights were long, cold, and boring unless you wanted to spend them counting fleas in your bed. Wealthier castles might have chandeliers or hanging lamps, but these were rare and didn't solve the general darkness that turned the castle into a shadowy maze where tripping was more common than finding a moment of peace. Hygiene was a chapter worthy of a medieval horror movie. Modern bathrooms didn't exist, and instead, castles had latrines, holes in the floor or wall that emptied outside, sometimes into a moat or a pile on the ground. Yes, you read that right. The moat, where we imagine epic battles with knights and swords, was often filled with things you wouldn't want to smell, step in, or imagine. Latrines were cold, uncomfortable, and smelled like someone forgot a cheese festival in the sun for a month. In larger castles, nobles might have a private latrine, a luxury comparable to owning a private jet today. But most inhabitants shared one or two latrines, meaning queuing in a freezing hallway while trying to ignore the sounds, smells, and stares of your neighbors. Latrines often lacked doors, so privacy was a distant dream, and the wind blowing through the hole made the experience even more unpleasant, especially in winter when sitting on a latrine felt like perching on a block of ice with a bad sense of humor. In some castles, latrines were built to overhang the walls, meaning waste fell directly outside, sometimes onto an unlucky guard or peasant passing below. Servants tasked with cleaning latrines had one of the worst jobs imaginable, without rubber gloves, masks, or antibacterial soap to protect them. Some advanced castles had rudimentary drainage systems, like clay pipes or stone channels, but these clogged easily, leaving an odor that permeated the entire castle and made even the wildflowers in the courtyard seem to give up. Running water was a fantasy not even the most imaginative troubadours could dream up. Getting water meant descending to the well, often located in the castle courtyard, which could be a long and exhausting trek if you lived in a high tower or distant wing. And don't assume the water was clean. Wells could easily become contaminated, especially if they were near stables, latrines, or piles of manure in the courtyard. In some cases, water had to be fetched from a nearby river or stream, meaning hauling heavy buckets over slippery paths, often in rain or snow. Bathing wasn't a priority in the Middle Ages, and while nobles might afford an occasional bath in a wooden tub, the water was usually lukewarm at best and shared among several people. Yes, the lord, his wife, his children, and hopefully not the dog used the same water, in that order, making the last person's experience rather murky. Dental hygiene was even worse. Teeth were cleaned, if at all, with a rag, a stick, or, in sophisticated cases, with ash or abrasive herbs. Medieval breath wasn't exactly a minty fresh advertisement, and some used herbs like cloves, parsley, or anise to mask it, though these were expensive and not always effective. Poor hygiene contributed to dental diseases, and it wasn't uncommon for people to lose teeth before age 30, which didn't help when chewing tough, salted meat. Skin suffered too. Without modern soaps, dirt accumulated, and skin conditions like eczema, infections, or lice were common even among nobles. Perfumes and oils, used by nobles to mask body odor, were an expensive luxury that didn't solve the underlying issue, and servants, who worked in dirty tasks like cleaning stables or cooking over open fires, had an even harder time staying minimally presentable. Food, which might seem like a comfort amidst all this discomfort, had its own drawbacks. If you were a noble, you could enjoy feasts with meat, bread, and wine, but the diet was monotonous and seasonal. In winter, when supplies dwindled, you were stuck with hard bread, watery porridge, and salted meat that tasted more like salt than meat, with a texture that challenged even the toughest teeth. Peasants and servants, the majority of the castle's inhabitants, ate even worse. Boiled turnips, bland porridge, perhaps some rancid cheese, and, on lucky days, a piece of bacon that had seen better days. The kitchen was often in a separate building to prevent fires, meaning food arrived cold at the table after a long journey through freezing, dark hallways. Without refrigeration, meat was salted, smoked, or dried, making it tough as a shoe sole and hard to chew, especially with medieval teeth in poor condition. Fresh vegetables were rare, and fruits like apples or berries were a seasonal luxury that vanished quickly. Spices like pepper, cloves, ginger, or saffron were a luxury for the rich, and without them, food could be so bland that even a boiled turnip felt like an insult to the palate. Imagine eating turnip soup without salt day after day. Not exactly a royal feast. Banquets, though impressive, were chaotic, with spilled food, shared plates, and a constant parade of servants rushing to keep everything in order. Utensils were limited. Most ate with their hands or a wooden spoon, and knives were shared, which wasn't exactly hygienic, especially if someone had a mouth infection. Food preservation was a constant issue, and it wasn't uncommon for food to spoil, especially in summer, leading to food poisoning that inhabitants couldn't always identify or treat. Wealthier castles might have cellars for storing wine or beer, but even these drinks could sour if not handled properly, and wine was often diluted with water to make it last longer, which didn't improve its taste. Beer, a staple for all classes, was safer than water because fermentation killed some bacteria, but its taste was functional at best, like a sour soup with no pretensions. Privacy was practically non-existent, adding another layer of discomfort to castle life. These fortresses were overcrowded, with the lord, his family, servants, soldiers, craftsmen, cooks, stable hands, and sometimes even animals living under the same roof. Private rooms were rare, and most inhabitants slept in the great hall on the floor or benches, surrounded by snores, flatulence, the occasional dog bark, and the creaking of wooden beams. Even nobles, who might have a private chamber, shared their space with servants sleeping on the floor to be available at any moment, making intimacy as rare as a hot bath. Imagine trying to have a romantic conversation with your partner while a servant snores 2 meters away, a rooster crows at 3 a.m., and a mouse decides to explore your bed. Bed curtains offered some privacy but didn't block sounds or smells, both of which were unavoidable and abundant in a castle. The lack of privacy affected all daily tasks. Dressing, eating, using the latrine, or even discussing personal matters were often done in the company of others, which could be as awkward as changing in a crowded locker room full of strangers. If all this sounds fascinating and you want to keep exploring the less glamorous side of medieval life, subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll find more videos on what living in the Middle Ages was really like, with details that'll make you grateful for your memory foam mattress, hot shower, and modern deodorant. And if you want to dive deeper into the topic, I've linked a book in the description that delves into the miseries and marvels of the medieval world.